everyone and welcome back to my channel BethChatsBooks. Now today's video is going to be my January wrap-up part 2. Now I know that you will say I am wearing the same outfit as my January wrap-up part 1, which is true because I'm filming it in the same day because I wanted to make sure that I get these done, ready to go before I have to go back to work next week and start my course and do all the things. So I'm trying to be organised, okay? Then I can dedicate a lot of vlogging time to the BookTube Octafinals. So let's just get stuck into this, shall we? So the first book I want to talk about is His Only Wife by Peace Adzo Mehdi. I've probably butchered that. I know a lot of people have pronounced it very differently. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. This follows contemporary style Ghana and the characters Afi and Eli Ganjos. So Afi is chosen to marry Eli by her mother, who has been asked by her employer, her female employer who comes from a wealthy family, to marry Eli, which is the middle son of the family. And we know at the beginning of the novel that he's had a relationship with another woman and the family doesn't approve and they want him as far away from this lady as possible. So Afi's under the impression that he has cut ties and she has been chosen to marry him so he can move on with his life. So they get married, suspicious from the very beginning. She gets married without him present. His older brother is there to represent his place for the wedding, which I've never heard of before. Apparently that was all fine in the book. And then she goes to start a life with him and realises slowly over time that he's clearly still in contact with this other woman. And what's she going to do about it? It gets a lot more complicated when this arranged situation gets deeper and Afi starts developing feelings for him and getting jealous of this other woman. So it's a really interesting premise. I know that this has been on Reese Witherspoon's book club pick. I received a NetGalley e-copy as well. I keep forgetting to mention in these videos when I get NetGalley proofs. I apologise. This was a NetGalley proof. But I've seen a lot of buzz go around it. I think this is really fun, this book, and I think the way it's been marketed is a little bit disappointing for this novel because it makes it seem very airy-fairy. So the picture has the two women and those bright block colours, making it seem like it's a contemporary or a women's fiction book, but I think it has a lot more depth to that. I think the character development is so interesting, and I think it's in line with similar interesting fiction that's come out in the last few years, like My Sister the Serial Killer, and different style genres where it is on the surface a certain genre, but it's got a depth of character development, if that makes sense. I can't think off the top of my head another novel like that, but that kind of style where it does a lot more than it's saying that it does on the blurb. So I really enjoyed this. I really felt for Afia. It really got me into the story, and I thought her husband was a shit, and I quite enjoyed being team Afi when I was reading this book. So I gave this 3.5. I think, yeah, the only thing that's been letting it down is its marketing, and I think so many people will really enjoy this book, so I highly recommend it. The next one I read was The Jigsaw Man by Nadine Matheson. Again, this was a NetGalley proof that I received, and this follows Angelica Henley, who is a detective who is trying to find a new killer. But what's worrying for her is that these bodies that she is finding are cut up and dismembered and body parts are strewn across the city. This is in London. And the MO is very similar to a famous killer that they nicknamed the Jigsaw Killer, who Angelica Henley worked on getting behind bars and he attacked her. And we kind of have a lot of references to that past experience. But the issue is he's in prison. So whoever's committing these murders is not the Jigsaw murderer, but he's obviously trying to emulate the MO of the Jigsaw Killer, the Jigsaw Man. So Angelica Henley gets thrown into this case. It brings up all the past and all the PTSD that came with that first case. She ends up going to visit the Jigsaw Man in prison to find out whether he can help them solve it. It's really good. It's one of the strongest thrillers that I've read so far in 2021. It's very dark though. When I was reading this, I kept thinking when I wrap this up, I need to make sure that people know that it is very vulgar and grotesque and intense. The violence mentioned and the dismemberment, things like that. So if you are really more on your tame side of thrillers, then I wouldn't really recommend picking this up if you don't want to have nightmares. But if you love your thrillers dark and creepy and just hella weird, then you will really, really love this, and I highly recommend you pick it up because it'll be the next thriller that you just sink your teeth into and just love. But it's hard with thrillers because you don't want to talk about them too much to give any spoilers, so I'm gonna park the Jigsaw Man there, but I highly, highly recommend. And I gave 4 out of 5 stars. I thought it was really, really strong. The next book I read was Don't Call It a Cult by Sarah Berman. It does have a really long title, but I'm just not going to say it, I'll just insert a picture. So this follows the NXIVM cult that was founded by Keith Raniere, and I also got a review copy of this, but I got this from Edelweiss as a downloadable copy. So this goes into a lot more detail about NXIVM the cult and about Keith Raniere. I mentioned in my review that I put on Goodreads that I think it's a really good companion piece document to the Sky documentary The Vow. I know that on Now TV there's a slightly different one going around, and I know that obviously if you live in the US or Canada, I presume it is different. It might be on HBO. There's a documentary floating around because obviously Keith Raniere was given a prison sentence, a very lengthy one, in 2020, so it's quite current, the demise of this cult. But I found that this book picked up a lot of things that were left unaddressed in that documentary, so I think that's why it makes a really great companion piece. I know that Sarah Berman had a close relationship to Sarah Edmondson, who was one of the whistleblowers on the cult, and she was involved herself. She was branded by the cult, so I think it allowed the victims' testimonies and witness statements and other things in this book to be a lot more powerful because it came from a relationship that harboured trust to get this bit of information or these bits of information out of the victims. So it goes into a lot more detail in this story about Keith Raniere's promiscuity, his relationship with a minor that was never really addressed in the documentary, about the woman who we will call Camilla, who is the minor, her sister, who they imprisoned in her own bedroom with the consent of her parents for 2 years. So there was some shady things that went down. Also, the Brofman sisters, the very wealthy Brofman sisters, it goes into a lot more of how they got involved, and they got their money involved, and their father was very distressed by their involvement in this cult, but he couldn't really seem to get them out of it. It goes into a lot more information about how DOS operated. So in the documentary it talks about DOS, this female branding sex cult element to the cult, and it goes into detail about the key players that weren't addressed in the documentary. So we'd heard a lot from Sarah's perspective of how she got involved, but we learn a lot more about Alison Mack and Laura Salzman's involvement. So it was really rich with extra material, which I loved because I was really interested when I watched the Sky documentary about this cult. I wanted to learn as much as possible. I didn't know about it, and then to have this book that gave all that additional information, but in a very well written way. It was engaging. It was still part of a story like the documentary. You could just pick it up and get lost in it, and that sounds really bad because these were people's lives and there were some horrific things that went down. But I'm really interested in the psychology of why people join cults, what motivates them, and how the structure of the cult came to be, and how Keith Raniere modified these teachings and how he picked victims. And this is a very sophisticated cult in comparison to other cults and organisations, and this has a very similar vein of enrollment to Scientology, and I just found it interesting and how that all worked and the mechanics of that from a psychology point of view. So really, really interesting. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars because I did find it incredibly informative personally. I found I learned a lot about what was motivating people, and like I said, that interests me. Then I read Conjur Women by Afia Atakora, and this was really beautiful and I didn't expect to enjoy it. So this again is a historical fiction, so I'm doing quite well with historical fiction this month. This follows Miss Rue, who lives on a plantation, and the timeline of the story is during slavery, during the Civil War time, and then post-slavery when they have what we call in the novel freedom time. And this follows Miss Rue, and Miss Maybelle was her mother, and she is meant to have the powers of conjuring and of curing that she's inherited from her mother. So her job is to bring the babies into the world from the plantation, and also her white slave owner wants her to keep the babies healthy. He likes mating his slaves, he likes putting them together and getting more children for the plantation, and it's her job to make sure the babies are delivered safe, and then to create little potions and cures for people in the plantation that need it. And then we go to present day, past the Civil War, and a lady on the plantation has a baby, and he comes out with jet black eyes and very, very light skin, unlike the black people that live on the plantation. So he gets the nickname from Miss Rue, Black-Eyed Bean, and everybody's very suspicious because they think things are starting to go wrong. Children are catching this mysterious illness and dying, and Bean is not being affected, and they're convinced that he is a curse put upon them for the freedom that they have post-Civil War, that they feel like they're being punished for. I found the whole conjuring thing really interesting. There's different dimensions and layers, and this book is very slow in its tone, its pacing, its feel is very lethargic and lyrical, but beautiful. I thought that would be really frustrating because you can't read this in a rush, but I really took my time with it and enjoyed it. I read it throughout the month. It wasn't just a really quick read, and I had it in physical format, so I thought I would read it quicker, but it didn't demand that I read it any faster. I got really involved in who Miss Rue was. There's a small selection of characters, and we really get to know them, and it deals with race and obviously the Civil War and slavery and what that means. It also explores this narrative of conjuring and whether people just like to believe in something as opposed to it having any magical properties. There's a pastor that comes to visit, and that's a great play dynamic in this book between the conjuring and religion and the hypocrisy of claiming to have the answers, and it gets a bit philosophical and existential when it raises those points that are addressed through the two characters and the butting of heads that they have and the conversations that they have. It deals a lot with motherhood and perceptions of people and the way that Bean is perceived in the community. It's really, really rich and really well done, and I had a really great time reading it, which I was really shocked about. So I highly recommend, if you love historical fiction, you will absolutely love this. If you've been loving recent novels that deal with the black identity in America, it doesn't have to be Civil War slavery time, but if you're really interested in this period of time and about slavery, there has been a lot of novels that are focused on plantations or elements of plantations. I know the Underground Railroad dealt with a plantation section. Books like Roost, which has obviously had a resurgence recently in importance. If you like plantation historical fiction, you will like this. Not to say you'd like it, because obviously they're very harrowing and upsetting, but if they're books that you tend to be drawn to, then you'll like this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then the next one I read was the Housewife Chronicles. I got a approved NetGalley e-copy of this, and this was self-published by the author herself. So she's written quite a few novels, and she said this was the most true to herself novel that she'd written. So this follows Beth, the main protagonist, which I thought was quite interesting because my name's Beth, and I realised I haven't actually read that many books with Beth as the protagonist. And her husband is dead, and they think it's from a heart attack. But we find out that Gina, who's the yoga instructor next door, was having an affair with her husband, and Beth kicked him out about a year before he dies, and he moves in with Gina next door. And Beth and her husband had a few kids together, and she was processing all of that when he died. But then the police investigators who come and take away the body think there's something suspicious, because when they do an autopsy they find out that there's some poisoning in his system. So they think someone might have killed him. So the fingers of suspicion point directly to Beth, because a lot of people think, why would Gina be involved? She got what she wanted out of the situation. So then that strikes up the novel. It has some weird elements to it where Beth has quite a few different suitors, so it almost feels like it changes tone from a thriller of who's murdered her husband to a bit of a romance element when she's got potential suitors and there's a bit of a romance storyline going on. Then you have the frenemy dynamic between Gina and Beth, and they keep getting pulled into the same social circle. So there was a lot going on, and I didn't like it. I didn't find that I felt settled in this novel. There was elements that I enjoyed, but I found Gina a very frustrating character, and the writer kept bringing Gina into the circle, and Gina was full of namaste peace, and she just wanted Beth to be her friend, and obviously she'd done something very distressing. Beth did not want to be her friend, and then the whole point of the book was almost to say that the women would rise above it in the end, which I think belittles the experience of being cheated on and of having your whole world come crashing down. And I thought that was oversimplistic. The relationship was just kind of a bit hallmarky at the end, and I didn't appreciate that. So I only gave it 2.5 out of 5 stars. It just wasn't my cup of tea. Maybe other people will enjoy it much more. I think she's a very well-respected author. So I think if it sounds interesting to you, you might really enjoy this book. I didn't want to be overcritical. Obviously, she self-published it herself, and it's fine to read. It just wasn't my thing. Then I read Where Ravens Roost by Karin Nordin. So this is set in Sweden. This follows Kjeld, who I've literally just googled how to say that name, Kjeld, and he gets a mysterious phone call from his father, who he hasn't spoken to in about 12 years. He's estranged from him. And he's very distressed on the phone, saying he's witnessed a murder. So he drops everything. He's currently under suspension area where he lives, pending an investigation where his friend has ended up being a murderer, and he had a close relationship. He was also a colleague in the police force. So he's currently under suspension pending review. So he hasn't got any work to do. So he gets this phone call and he rushes to the town where he was born to see his father. When he gets there, he finds out that his father is suffering with dementia, and he doesn't know if he's reliable or not, but then he starts to believe what his father has said to him. His father also owns a rookery with ravens in it, and that played a really creepy part because those ravens really freaked me out, which I thought was quite an interesting, different dimension to the story. So it becomes a bit of a thriller, particularly when Kjeld finds a body in his father's rookery. So there's nobody there to tell him what's happened. He's trying to tease that out of his father. And there is some other key players that own the big organisation that helps fund the town, and they get involved because one of the CEOs of that company goes missing and everyone thinks the body might be his. And then we go from there with the thriller. I don't want to ruin it because I think it was well constructed. I know this is going to be part of a series, and I'm very much interested to continue on with the series. I don't think it was as good as the Jigsaw Man. That's why I've only given it 3.5, but I think it was well done. I really like the setting of Sweden. I really like how Kjeld is a grumpy protagonist, but also how he's clearly non-binary, because it mentions how he was married to his husband, but then he seems to have a lot of intimate relationships and a sexual relationship with a woman in this novel. So he is clearly non-binary, which I think is really refreshing, and he just hates people, and I can really connect with him. I find him really interesting because he's going to be multifaceted and multi-layered, and hopefully we get more development later on in the series with him. But a really great start to the series, and I really did enjoy it. Then I read Luster by Raven Bonnie, and this one was interesting. I really wanted to love it, and I feel a bit meh about it. And I also kind of rushed the book because I wanted to give it back, and I had so many other books to read, and I don't know whether if I'd have just slowed it down and read it again, maybe I would enjoy it. So I'm going to order it at some point in physical copy so I can take my time and read it again and see if it was just the wrong time. So this follows Eddie, who is a black woman living in New York. I think it's set in New York. And she has a publishing job, and she gets fired from that job at the beginning of the novel because of her inappropriate sexual relationships with male colleagues. She strikes up a kind of relationship with a man called Eric online, and she meets him, finds out he's married, but he has an open relationship, an open marriage. And then she ends up at some point living in his house, which he's not aware of. The wife invites her to live in the house when she realises she doesn't really have anywhere to live. And she kind of strikes up a bit of a friendship with Eric's wife, and she becomes a bit of a mentor to Eric's adopted daughter, who is also black. And it's an exploration of what it means to be a young black woman in America today. I think it has a lot of really interesting things about it. I just think this was marketed wrong. Everybody said this was going to be steamy, it was really sexual, it was a threesome kind of relationship where she moves in with this couple. It's not that at all. There's elements where Eric is very cold to Edie. There's a lot of commentary on race. It's not a steamy book. It's a reflective book. It's very hard to categorise it, but I think a bit like Three Women by Lisa Taddeo, it's just been marketed all wrong. So I was going into this being like, oh my god, it's going to be really steamy, all about sexuality, and it wasn't. It had a sadness to it. It had a melancholy element to it that I didn't anticipate, and maybe because I'd gone in with the wrong expectations, maybe that's why I only gave it 3.5. It's because we just weren't vibing on the same level. But I don't want to talk too much about this book because I kind of want to settle a bit and see how other people feel about this book, and maybe if there's overlap. Or people might be able to do a really good review in which all of what I've just said might be rubbish and I might have just got the wrong end of the stick. I don't know how I feel about it because I wanted to love it so much, and it's the most highly anticipated debut of this year, except that I didn't enjoy it, and I really want to hear what the people think as more people read it and see whether anybody felt the same way as I did, or maybe it was just the wrong time. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say on it for now. And the last book I read was The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans, and I got a NetGalley e-book proof copy of this. I also got an e-book copy of Where Ravens Roost. And this is a short story collection about being black in America as well. It has some interesting stories. So the first story that I read was hard to describe. It was about a music artist who she'd been slammed by her ex-boyfriend. He'd said something about her appearance and she'd made her inspiration for a music video, and she went to the Titanic Museum where this black lady was working, and at the end the black lady sleeps with the producer, but it kind of it has depth. It talks about race and identity. It's hard to describe. I think short story collections are very hard to describe, but I'm really enjoying the stories. I'm really getting into them. I think it has a lot to say. The first two stories I really enjoyed, usually with a short story collection. If you get into the second story and you're kind of questioning what it's about or meh about it, then you're not going to enjoy it. But from the second story I was excited to read more, so I gave it 3.5. I think with short story collections it's very hard to give it the full 5 stars because you have to kind of like every single book in the collection. But I really like her writing style. It's really easy to get into. I think that this has so much promise. It's a really strong short story collection, and I recommend that people go and read it because I think it's really relevant and current now. But that's everything. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.